This is Business Weekend with Edward Boyd.
Hello and welcome to Business Weekend. I'm Edward Boyd. Coming up, global markets have been shaken by the war in Iran. Oil and gas prices have been surging, energy infrastructure has been attacked, flights have been grounded, and the conflict has spread to the wider Middle East region. Today I host a special defence industry panel focusing on Australia's sovereign capabilities with Mike Johnson, the CEO of the Australian Industry and Defence Network, and Steve Baxter, venture capital investor.
Given the level of distaste for defence businesses in Australia, they face the risk of being debanked, to be honest.
Reserve Bank Governor Michelle Bullock and Treasurer Jim Chalmers, they're clearly concerned with the developments in the Middle East and what they mean for the economy and interest rates. I sit down with Westpac Chief Economist Lucy Ellis, who was in Canberra on Friday offering economic advice to the Treasurer ahead of the May federal budget.
You know, these are things the government could do with its own behaviour to get better outcomes.
Plus, Swiss watchmaker Breitling has just signed a multi-year deal with Aston Martin ahead of the first round of the Formula One in Melbourne this weekend. Breitling CEO George Kern is on the program. He's worried about the Iranian conflict, tariffs and consumer sentiment.
Well, I only have worries. I have worry with the war in Iran. I have worries with the war in Ukraine. I have worries with the exchange rates of the Swiss francs.
When it comes to markets in 2026, it's all about expecting the unexpected. Shockwaves hit global shares this week due to the eruption of geopolitical tensions with joint US and Israeli strikes against Iran and counterstrikes from Iran across the Middle East. Critical energy infrastructure has been damaged and some of the world's largest oil and gas producers in the region are cutting back on production due to shipping constraints in the Strait of Hormuz. Energy prices have been surging and major commodities like gold have experienced high levels of volatility. To help improve oil supply, the United States is even allowing India to buy oil from Russia, a country laden with numerous economic sanctions. This uncertainty puts the future market performance up in the air, with more questions than answers on just how long the conflict will take to resolve, if at all.
The economic effects are far-reaching. Everything from energy price spikes to inflation and interest rates, as well as cost of living and consumption impacts. RBA Governor Michelle Bullock made sure to emphasise that even the RBA board is uncertain about the appropriate next steps when it comes to the domestic economy.
The past few days have seen a significant escalation in conflict and instability in the Middle East, which is deeply concerning. It's too early to say what the economic impact will be. Events are moving rapidly and there are different ways that this can play out. We're going to take some time to make sense of what it could mean for inflation here. As much as I know the public would like more certainty about the direction of interest rates, it would be wrong for us to pretend we have greater certainty than we do.
The Governor of the RBA flagging uncertainty, particularly because of the trade-off between higher inflation and a potential hit to global growth, both of which require different moves in the blunt instrument that is monetary policy. In that vein, Ms Bullock has made it clear that the March meeting is live.
Every meeting is live. And if you go back when we were coming out of COVID, for example, and inflation was shooting towards 7%, we weren't waiting for quarterly meetings then. We were moving much more quickly. Then you'll recall, actually, when the markets expected us to move in July last year and we didn't, that caused a lot of angst as well, and now I think they're settled on the fact that we only go every quarter. I would dissuade them from thinking that. I'm not making a prediction about March, but it will be a live meeting. We have inflation at 3.8% headline and we have unemployment at 4.1%, tight. The board will be actively looking at whether or not it needs to move more quickly. So I would discourage people from thinking that we necessarily only move every quarter.
Add to that a beat in GDP, with the annual growth up to 2.6% last week, beating consensus of 2.2%. No surprise, bond traders have upped bets then for another interest rate rise in a couple of weeks. And Warren Hogan from EQ Economics says it makes it very easy for the RBA to hike and put it down to geopolitics.
The oil price movements we've seen in the last week, on top of what we'd already seen this year, mean that we're going to get more inflation, This data confirms the economy is recovering, governments of Australia are not pulling back. And of course, would the Treasurer prefer a rate hike a week before his budget in May, which is what the market thinks will happen, or would he prefer one in 2 weeks when he can blame it on Trump? I think it's pretty clear what the mechanics of this is, and I think we're going to get a rate hike in 2 weeks. And hopefully we won't get one in May, but we may need one then as well.
On a more positive note, it also shows Australia is on solid footing heading into a very uncertain medium term.
We know that we've got three big, substantial, pressing challenges in our economy: inflation, productivity and global uncertainty. And those three challenges are our focus as a government and as we get closer to releasing our government's fifth budget. But we face these very substantial economic challenges from a position of genuine strength. Stronger, broader growth provides the best foundation to deal with what's coming at us in the weeks and months and years ahead.
The spike in energy prices, though, has been significant. Supply heavily impacted by the geopolitical tensions, and now we are seeing a potential worst-case scenario, according to analysts. The Strait of Hormuz officially closed for business for now.
And so if you look at just for oil, where you've got up to 20 million barrels a day of oil and oil products withheld, over the course of a month, that's the equivalent of the entire strategic petroleum reserve in the United States and then some not being able to make it to market. And perhaps even more acute is on the liquefied natural gas side, where, unlike oil, LNG can't be easily stored. So very quickly, in a matter of days, Qatar will have to start turning down its production if it can't get its ships to take and evacuate the LNG. And if you remember in the 2022 Ukraine war, when Russia turned its gas off to Europe and we saw an energy price shock that went around the world, that was just about 50 million tonnes per annum of LNG. Now we're talking about 80 million tonnes of LNG at risk, plus 20 million barrels a day of oil. We've not seen this much acutely at risk in the market since back in the 1970s when we had the Arab oil embargo and the Iranian Revolution. In fact, this could be 3 times bigger than that in the more extreme bookend case.
So what's the fallout of this? Well, obviously it impacts oil, petrol prices, input costs, and therefore cost of living. But an energy shock of this magnitude could also bring on recessionary conditions to global growth.
And then at the more extreme end is the one I talked about before, where most of the volumes of the Strait of Hormuz are impacted. And then we're facing an unprecedented energy shock that we've not seen in generations that would cause a global economic recession.
On the flip side, domestic oil producers are actually poised for an upswing.
Australia's a big exporter, particularly of LNG, and LNG could be impacted in terms of prices going up even more than oil here. So you've seen that reflected in Woodside, Santos Beach, Karoon. And particularly some of these stocks have been really beaten up and really haven't rallied like other commodities have over the last year. And so they're finally catching a bit of wind on the back of this geopolitical risk. It does go to show how all these pessimistic forecasts, which have been widespread consensus going back a year, can be turned on their head by a geopolitical event somewhere else around the world. And that's why risk often is to the upside for a lot of these names, because oil can only go down so much, but when it goes up, it can go up a lot.
So the effect of the recent escalation in the Middle East on markets is certainly material, with the economic consequences only contained if there can be some sort of resolution. And that's looking unlikely in the short term.
Australia was inadvertently drawn into the Iranian conflict this week, with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese confirming on Sky News that 3 Australian Defence Force personnel were on board the American submarine, which sank an Iranian warship in the Indian Ocean. The ADF members were permitted to be on board the American vessel as part of the AUKUS arrangement, which will eventually transfer several nuclear-powered Virginia-class submarines from the US to Australia in the early 2030s. But as this conflict in the Middle East intensifies, what does it mean for Australia and our own sovereign capabilities? Let's bring in here Mike Johnson, the CEO of the Australian Industry and Defence Network, and Steve Baxter, a venture capital investor focused on the defence sector. Mike, I want to start with you. The Prime Minister, he says military assets have been deployed to the Middle East to help support our allies, and now we've heard that 3 Defence Force personnel were on board the submarine. We're a long way from the Middle East here in Australia, but it seems like we're slowly being drawn into this conflict. Well,
I don't know if drawn in is the right phrase to use, in all honesty. I mean, obviously, these these submariners are on the vessel as part of the AUKUS lead-in program, and I think that's an important distinction to make. There are a number of countries involved in the conflict at the moment, but having people on these submarines is very important for the AUKUS program of work for Australia, which will support our SMEs and our sovereign capability here.
Yes, Steve, these 3 ADF personnel on board as part of the AUKUS deal, I mean, how valuable is that experience going to be for them to be on board this week?
I think it's exceptionally valuable. I mean, obviously, it's pretty tragic that loss of life occurs. There is a conflict going on, and there's 2 warships involved in this action. We had sailors deployed on a quasi-exchange, I suppose, as a part of the AUKUS program. The fact we now have 3 sailors who are not only qualifying on a nuclear submarine, but also part of an offensive action and the torpedoing of an enemy vessel, I think has to be beneficial for the Australian Navy if you want to look at this in the proper military context.
Mike, these attacks on Iran began roughly a week ago. Once they commenced, things seem to they've really escalated pretty quickly. Does it seem like the US, Israel and Iran are happy to play the long game here? In other words, could this conflict potentially go for weeks or be drawn out even longer?
Well, I think you'd have to ask some of the main players that are involved. Unfortunately, in Australia, we don't run US politics, so I couldn't answer that on behalf of the US government. I think the challenge here is the impact that this will have on Australian business and defence industry, and one of the key things is obviously the oil producing and the shipping of oil means that we'll see a rise in Australia of fuel, and fuel drives a rise in transport costs, and transport costs cause a rise in the cost of living and the cost of goods in Australia, and that potentially could drive up the interest rates. So domestically back here at home, I think we're really running the risk of seeing increased cost of living and pressure on business once again to try and survive in a challenging climate.
Yes, Steve, as Mike says, we've seen that big impact already on commodity prices. Oil, gas rising sharply. Petrol here in Australia now looking like it's above $2 a litre. Is this part of Iran's strategy, you think, to choke the world of energy and push up inflation and potentially interest rates for major economies?
Oh, I think it's probably part of the strategy. I can't read the minds of madmen, and that's who was and probably is now in control of Iran. But when you look at the tools in their toolbox, you'd have to think those economic levers will need to be pulled if they're serious about, I suppose, fighting their economy and fighting their nation. So, but it's more you'd be concerned about the kinetics, the new age of drones and missiles, and then the exhaustion of allied stocks of defensive armaments as well as offensive armaments that this is causing. So, looking at oil and gas and fuel can find its way to Australia in many ways, and we are hostage to the international energy price. But also, I think we really cared about energy. We actually might care to actually get our own local energy prices down here and get a bit real with our own energy generation here. So we shouldn't pick and choose which energy we care about that goes up.
Mike, you obviously represent hundreds of small, medium-sized defence businesses in Australia. I mean, what does this widening conflict kind of mean for them? Are their products and services going to potentially be in higher demand in the future?
Well, it's an interesting question, Ed, and I think the challenge that we have here is, as Steve said, the kinetic effect of what's happening means that some of the stocks that are being depleted are very high level stocks. I mean, we've got $400,000 missiles being used to defeat $20,000 drones. When we look at the opportunities from Australia, we need to consider the sovereign capability of what we have in Australia. And we've got some of the best businesses in the world in terms of intelligence, capability to supply, and capability to pivot and really supply those things in a very timely manner. I think COVID was a great exemplar of how Australia responds to the need. And certainly there will be some elements of business in Australia that will take advantage of this. There will be other elements of business in Australia that will be under pressure. I think at times when you get a particular need and the government wants to drive it, the government will actually determine pretty quickly what they need, what we need to supply, and they should be able to make it available not only through funding but perhaps some slight tweaks to some regulations and some policies to make it available. One of the inherent challenges in Australia for our manufacturers is actually freight, and that is the very thing that the cost of freight will rise. And Australia is lucky that we're geographically geographically separated from some of these other hotspots in the world, that we can actually do this in relative peace. Again, it's a double-edged sword because our biggest cost then will be freight. So fingers crossed we get the benefit out of this. It is a shame that we're seeing loss of life in other areas around the world, but if it's good for defence industry, ultimately it should benefit Australian economics as well.
Yes, Steve, you work with a lot of defence business startups. I mean, are there any you can think of right now that might be having a positive potential outlook on this conflict and their business going forward?
I know of great businesses in Australia that have equipment in that conflict or components in equipment in that conflict. And I actually dare not name them because I think they're, given the level of distaste for defence businesses in Australia, they face the risk of being debanked, to be honest. But we have some great companies there providing products and components to other products in that conflict. The one sort of standout one I think that's probably got a good run is an Australian-developed product out of Adelaide called the Nulka, N-U-L-K-A. It's a missile decoy system deployed not only on Royal Australian Navy vessels but also on US Navy vessels, which is being used a lot. So it decoys a missile away from a naval vessel under fire. So we do have some great Australian technology, and proof is in the pudding that we are really good at developing this stuff. And there are some really good SMEs with gear in that theatre now. But you have to take my word for it. And we can probably do that off camera if you want, Ed.
Yeah, Mike, some of your members, are there any spring to mind that you can think of that are sort of having their products currently being used in the Middle East right now?
Look, the short answer is yes, absolutely, but similar things we've seen at events in Canberra over the last couple of weeks, a large number of protesters and some kinetic protest activities which required police intervention. So, yes, we do have a lot of SME members. We have a lot of fantastically skilled SME members. We have a lot of fantastic products that could support various elements, both offensive, defensive and denial. And I really hope we will be lobbying hard, and I am in Parliament House, in fact, 4 times this week, to make sure that SME members of Aden actually get their voices heard and make sure that we push for the capability that is sovereign in Australia to go and support such an important task, and to make sure we minimise the ongoing effect of this so that we can actually sustain peace within this region of the world.
Yeah, and Mike, just as a follow-up there, on our own sovereign defence capabilities, I mean, how reliant are we on foreign manufacturers to build defence products for us, or do we manufacture a lot of things ourselves here in Australia?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And the challenge for Australia is that we have defence primes that manufacture the overarching and end result. We do, however, have a lot of SMEs. We have over 700 members ourselves, and a large part of that membership base produces components or does maintenance and support activities for individual pieces of those final supply solutions. Now, this means that whilst we may not supply an entire end product, we are involved. We're intrinsically involved in a lot of the components and a lot of the support for these things. Some of that actually comes down to IP that's owned in Australia. Some of it is actually supporting the endeavours of overseas organisations. As always, the challenge is a lot of it is classified, so we can't talk about that, but it is beneficial to the Australian economy to be able to do this. And, hopefully we'll get to see a lot more of that coming into the future. I might just say one of our challenges in Australia is actually our fuel supply. And so, our shipping lanes are very strategic into Australia. We get a lot of goods and we get most of our fuel shipped in. And so that will be a key strategic piece for Australia to ensure we can maintain that supply.
And Steve, in the intro, we talked a little bit about the AUKUS submarine deal. I mean, how important is that going to be for Australia's sovereignty going into the 2030s and defending things like fuel supply?
Oh, very much so. A submarine's a fantastic piece of capability in a naval context, I suppose. AUKUS is a lot more about submarines. Roughly sort of 8/10 of it's about submarines, and the rest is about other defence goods, artificial intelligence, hypersonics, and autonomy, and you name it. So the AUKUS agreement in general is really good for Australia going forward. Once again, I'll go back to the fact that we now have 3 submariners who've actually been on a submarine that's been used in combat. That, whilst macabre, is actually a great asset for the Royal Australian Navy.
And Mike, the federal government, it's in the process of establishing a new defence delivery agency to be led by a national armaments director. I mean, how big a shake-up is this for Australia's defence sector?
Well, potentially it's very, very large. I mean, we'll see a shift in where contract management versus project management goes in defence procurement items in Australia. One can only imagine that there'll be a large chunk of the defence budget that will sit under the National Armaments Director. We don't yet have a lot of scope on that. There is some conjecture that maybe we're reopening the door to the old defence material or DMO days, and I don't think that will be the case. I think any government that comes in and wants to create a change in defence will basically create something new. Obviously, defence is one of those things, it's not run as a business, it's run as a cost centre. When you're defending the nation, we now have two extra domains, being cyber and space, that perhaps we didn't have 30 or 40 years ago. So that's a new avenue. But when we talk about running defence, providing budget for defence, it's something that the government needs to look at very strategically. And I think the success or the failure of the NAD role will come down to who they appoint into that role. Hopefully it's somebody that has a very strong sense of Australian spirit, wants to do it for this great country, and also has a lot of commercial experience as well, so they can make sure our defence operates in the manner at which it needs to maintain effect for our great country.
And Steve, just on the budget, Treasurer Jim Chalmers is going to release that in May. Do you think this conflict could encourage him to raise the percentage of GDP spending spent on defence?
No. To be honest, I think I'd like to think that was the case. I think that the current government believes that they're far more friendly to welfare spending than defence spending, which I think is problematic. So ultimately, the issues inside defence, and defence is an organisation full of the most lovely sort of, dedicated people, but it's a large organisation, it's quite bureaucratic. And I don't think anyone who thinks they're doing a great job when it comes to capability acquisition and sustainment, for example. So something there needs to change. Is it this new thing? I don't know, but ultimately, even if they get that perfect, if that defence top-line budget doesn't move from a 2% something to a 3%, even closer to 4 or 5%, then we are not being a good ally to our security guarantor, who's the United States.
Steve Baxter and Mike Johnson, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Ed.
After the break, Westpac Chief Economist Lucy Ellis has just been in Canberra herself, offering some economic advice to the Treasurer Jim Chalmers ahead of that May budget we were just talking about. We'll speak to her about the budget, plus the price shock stemming from the Iranian conflict and the comparisons with Russia's 2022 invasion of the Ukraine. Back then, she was an assistant governor of the Reserve Bank, where she helped make cash rate decisions. Welcome back. Australia's economy during calendar year 2025 grew 2.6%. Now, that's its fastest pace in nearly 3 years. GDP surged almost 1% during the December quarter, thanks to a strong contribution from both the public and private sectors. But what do the strong numbers mean for the Reserve Bank, which is obviously closely watching the price of oil, gas and petrol surging due to the attacks on Iran? Well, let's bring in here Lucy Ellis, the Chief Economist at Westpac. Lucy, thanks for your time. I want to start with Iran. I mean, the surging price of commodities, how worried is the Reserve Bank going to be about oil potentially getting towards $100 a barrel?
Ed, it's great to be here. The war is concerning for itself. It is escalating. It is bringing in more countries. Iran is seeing this as existential. So it is fighting back very hard, and it is hitting a lot of infrastructure that are pinch points in the global economy, and particularly closing the Strait of Hormuz, but also attacking the gas facilities in Qatar. So this is a big supply shock. It is going to increase the price of oil. It already has done so. It is going to increase petrol prices, and we've seen that at the Bowser already this week. The modelling that the Westpac economics team has done suggests it could be a 25% increase. It could be a 1% increase if the war $1 increase if the war drags on. So it is concerning, but you've got to remember that's a one-off increase in the price. It doesn't mean that inflation keeps going on at that higher rate for forever. And in order to abstract from those one-off shocks, the RBA focuses on the trimmed mean inflation that takes out all the biggest increases and the biggest falls and takes the average over the rest. And so the trimmed mean inflation measure probably won't be affected by this. And so the RBA will want to look through any kind of supply shock like this. Now, that gets harder the longer the war drags on, the higher oil prices go, particularly as petrol prices is one of those things that households focus on when they're thinking about inflation and where it might go from here. So the RBA will be watching inflation expectations. They'll be nervous, but they won't be moving on that. They won't be reacting to something that hasn't happened yet. They'll be waiting to see what that does to inflation expectations and downstream costs.
The last time there was a big supply shock, 2022, the price of oil got to 120 a barrel when Russia invaded Ukraine. I know you were working at the RBA at that point, and I think the cash rate started 2022 0.1%, finished the year at 3.1%. I mean, how much of those rate rises could potentially be attributed to oil hitting that high level around February?
Honestly speaking, almost none. Back then, interest rates had been at emergency levels because we'd just come out of the pandemic. They were always going to go back to something like normal, wherever normal was. And in fact, they did have to become more restrictive because we did have that big bout of inflation well beyond oil prices. The price of everything went up during that period, whether it was building costs, food, hotel bills, everything was more expensive because we just opened up. There'd been a lot of government support, interest rates had been low, and people were ready to spend, and that put pressure on supply capacity that hadn't fully come back yet. And then that subsided as supply capacity came back. The oil price wasn't a whole lot to do with it. To the extent there was anything that then flowed through to prices in Australia, other than petrol, we did have some issues with the electricity market during that time. Gas prices tend to go up in tandem with oil prices, and normally that shouldn't hit electricity prices, but there was, a conflagration of unfortunate events that really hit the electricity market in Australia, even though we should have been more insulated, and that's the reason why we've been dealing with higher electricity prices since then. The way the electricity market was configured was just very vulnerable to higher gas prices. So that is something to watch, but the local market for gas is actually somewhat insulated from global prices. I mean, one thing to bear in mind is it's actually a big boost to the government budget because along with the gold miners, along with the iron ore miners, now the gas producers are going to be reaping in more profits, and that will be a boost to the budget bottom line.
So Governor Bullock this week said the next meeting is live. It's in less than 2 weeks' time. How is they going to interpret the recent GDP numbers? Strong economic growth last year, but unemployment, very low levels as well.
Yeah.
What are they going to do?
Look, every meeting is always live in the 8-meeting schedule. In a way, it wasn't always in the 11-meeting schedule. There's always lots of real data in between meetings. We've had the national accounts, we had the wages data, we've got a decent amount of labour market and inflation data in between, since the February meeting, and that's great. The actual economy, to be honest, the picture was a bit more mixed than a lot of people realise. Consumption was a bit softer than we had been expecting, or the Reserve Bank had been expecting. I mean, if it had come in as we expected, I think I would be more concerned about the RBA moving in March.
Might have economic growth been closer to 3% if consumption had been higher, or?
Assuming nothing else was different as well.
Yeah.
The reality, I mean, what's interesting is actually growth through the year was exactly what we thought because history got revised up. And I think that's actually a really important signal. We would regard the national accounts this week as being evidence against the idea that Australia can only grow at about 2%. It turns out that we actually grew faster than we thought earlier in the year and got the same inflation that we already knew about. That says Australia can actually grow a bit faster than what people thought a week ago. And the productivity numbers were also, through the year, actually pretty benign. We were quite pleased to see that confirmation of what we were expecting, that pickup in market sector productivity. Overall productivity growth over 2025 was 1%. That's quite a bit above what the RBA is assuming, and so that's evidence against this idea that Australia can only grow at 2%. Growth was pretty strong in the back half, in the second half of 2025, but at the moment we would see it as a steady as she goes story, but the consumer is a bit softer than what we thought, and there's a sense in which the consumer's being crimped to make room for all the other growth that's going on. Government spending is still growing at a decent clip, although not as strong as before, but business investment and housing investment have picked up. That's a good news story in terms of future supply capacity, but we do have to make room for that. It is a call on resources, and so the RBA will be very nervous. We do expect them to raise rates in May, but are they going to do that? Are they going to do it just as a war's broken out, and when the productivity story is actually going against what they previously thought? That, I think, is a harder ask.
I know you've also been in Canberra this week. I mean, what are some of the things the government can focus on ahead of the May budget?
Well, obviously, I can't talk about the discussions that actually happened at the round table this week. But in terms of some of the things that Westpac Economics and Westpac as an organisation has been talking about, there's a lot of things we can do. One of the other things that came out of the national accounts was the realisation that the tax burden is increasing again. The share of household income going to tax is increasing again. And that's one of the things that's crimping spending, although people are saving more as well. And at some point we've got to say, well, great, you're able to raise the revenue to do all the things that you want to do, but are there ways we could achieve the social outcomes we want more efficiently? Are there things we could do to keep a lid on other people's costs? I mean, one of the things, it's not the main thing, but one of the things that's boosting inflation at the moment is all the prices that governments control. Postal charges up 5%, council rates up around 6%, water in Sydney went up 13% in October. These are all things the various governments at different levels decide. And what we would be better to see would be if all levels of government agree that if we've charged the Reserve Bank with getting inflation at 2.5%, they should be raising their prices by only 2.5% as well. We should also be looking at things like procurement. The government could change the way it procures and say, we're not going to agree to a multi-year service contract with a price escalation of CPI or 3% or 4%. It's got to be 2.5%. These are things the government could do with its own behaviour to get better outcomes. We've got to get a grip on some of the social care spending growth. These are important programs that are delivering good outcomes for people, but we need to do it more efficiently and more sustainably. Otherwise, the tax burden on the household is going to get higher and higher.
Lucy Ellis, Chief Economist at Westpac, great to chat to you.
Thanks, Ed. Always a pleasure.
Well, when the Reserve Bank lifts interest rates, there's usually an immediate impact on property demand and national property prices. Higher rates reduce borrowing power for buyers and can discourage first home buyers in particular, along with investors from taking on new loans. But curiously, during the month of February, the Reserve Bank did raise rates and national property prices, they increased 0.5%. The median value of a home across the country has surpassed $1 million for the first time. Carly Chatfield reports.
The property market roared in 2025, marking a standout year for the sector. National prices surged 9.1% in the past 12 months, led by double-digit growth in Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and Darwin. The surge was fueled by low interest rates after the Reserve Bank delivered 3 rate cuts in 2025. But a burst of unexpected inflation in the December quarter shifted the landscape.
Today's inflation figures represents terrible news for hard-working Australians.
The RBA acted swiftly at its Monetary Policy Board meeting days later, hiking rates for the first time in more than 2 years.
We've updated our assessment and outlook for the economy and concluded that the cash rate was no longer at the right level to get inflation back to target in a reasonable time frame.
The impact of the February rate hike was felt immediately. Erkan Ersan, director at Ray White Erskineville, Glebe, Alexandria and Surrey Hills, says buyer activity shifted quickly.
Yeah, we used to average about 20 to 25 buyers through our inspections. At the moment, that number has rounded down to about 10 to 15.
Auctions are still drawing crowds, but, he says, buyer urgency faded.
I've noticed that the buyers are a little bit more cautious at the moment. So they are still attending the auctions and they are still bidding, but they're a bit more reserved with how much they're paying for property.
Some sellers are now more willing to accept a price before their auction day.
I've also picked up that a lot of owners are actually selling before auction when they recognise they've got a standout buyer.
On the flip side, some prospective home buyers are still finding it tough to secure a property. Jo Yates is in the market to buy a property to renovate with her sister. She also currently holds mortgages for her primary residence and an investment property. Jo has been dealt a double blow: increased repayments on her existing mortgages and tougher conditions for her next purchase.
So when the rates went up in February, pretty much all of my mortgages have now gone up. So my principal place of residence has increased, and as has my investment property. And then what that also means is that when we're looking for a property to renovate, we're going to struggle to buy something.
REA Group senior economist Angus Moore says it's still early days since the rate hike, but he expects the impact to flow through to home price growth in the months ahead.
It's probably a bit too soon to have seen a big effect from rate hikes. We'd expect that higher rates are going to slow the pace of price growth for the simple reason that, when rates go up, borrowing capacities come down, and so people just have less that they can spend.
The rate hike has forced some buyers to shift their strategy, searching interstate to secure a property.
So we're now looking to buy a property together in Melbourne, just because the costs on the Sunshine Coast, where we were looking to buy originally, have increased so much over the last 4 months that we've now been priced out of that area with the mortgage that we can get.
Surging prices and the rate hike not only compelled the sisters to reconsider where to buy, but also what kind of property they can afford.
We're now going to be looking for a small property, potentially a townhouse or an apartment.
Mortgage holders are also feeling the squeeze from the rate rise, with homeowners in Sydney, Brisbane and Perth, the most expensive cities, copping the biggest increase in monthly repayments. For Jo, her mortgage repayments have surpassed the rental income from her investment property.
It upsets me that I have to put the rent up on my tenants when I know that they've got a new baby and they would struggle to go and get somewhere else, but I'm going to struggle to keep repaying that mortgage as well.
She even sought a broker to help her handle the rising mortgage repayments.
I have spoken to a broker last week, and we are looking at different ways to restructure everything that I own and that I'm going to own, so that I can hopefully reduce those repayments.
Investor lending continued to climb in 2025, with investor loans jumping to 40% of all loans in the December quarter.
We've seen a big ramp in investor activity in the past couple of years, and what that means is that as a share of buyers, investors are very high.
Even with rate pressure mounting, investor activity remains resilient.
In fact, since the rate rise, I've seen some more investors coming into the market. I guess they're hoping that there's less owner-occupiers and less competition at our auctions.
So we'll probably see a continued high level of investor activity, because that's really being driven by the fact that rental market conditions are just very, very tight at the moment.
Following January's inflation spike, the next rate hike is forecast in May, with money markets pricing in 1 or 2 more increases this year. For some, the prospect of slower property growth this year will come as a relief.
Our expectation is we will continue to see home prices rising this year, though probably not at the pace that we were seeing last year. The fact that we're seeing rate hikes this year will probably chill a bit of demand and slow the pace of price growth.
For others, the possibility of further rate hikes means tightening budgets and lifestyle adjustments.
And I'll potentially have to increase the rent on my tenants as soon as I'm able to. In fact, I probably will have to do that to be able to afford to keep that property. And it will mean that we'll have to reduce spending in my household.
February's rate hike has so far had a modest impact on property activity, but the broader question remains whether the Reserve Bank can successfully tame inflation.
Coming up after the break, do interest rates affect people who would spend upwards of $10,000 on a luxury watch? The CEO of Swiss watch manufacturer Breitling, George Kern, is up next. He's just signed a partnership deal with car manufacturer Aston Martin, but he's worried about tariffs, rate rises and consumer sentiment. Welcome back. Swiss luxury watch manufacturer Breitling has signed a multi-year agreement with Aston Martin, the British car maker which supports the Aston Martin Aramco Formula One team. The Australian Grand Prix is being held in Melbourne this afternoon, and there's been a few difficulties with some of the team members taking longer than expected to travel here due to the conflict in the Middle East disrupting flights. Breitling and Aston Martin crossed paths in the 1960s when Sean Connery wore a Breitling timepiece in the James Bond film Thunderball. I caught up with the CEO of Breitling, George Kern, this week, and we spoke about the luxury watch market, consumer sentiment and the partnership with Aston Martin.
Well, Aston Martin is a fantastic company with an incredible history. It's not only the Formula One team we are partnering with, but it's also the history of Aston Martin with iconic cars like the DB5, which by the way was in a James Bond movie. We were the first Q watch in Thunderball present in a James Bond movie with a top time. And then we have the third pillar, which are the Lagonda watches. So, or the Lagonda cars where we will make watches for. So we have three pillars. And I think the image of the brand, the iconic status of the brand is something which attracted us to partner with them.
Yeah, I'd say some customers would really associate your brand with aviation, but just hearing that history about Thunderball and motorsport, it doesn't seem like a big leap then for you to move into working with Aston Martin.
Yeah, and the interesting point here is that many Formula One drivers were actually also pilots and piloting planes, like Jim Clark, for instance, who used then to drive an Aston Martin at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. So they took actually their watches from their plane, which was a pilot watch, like the Navitimer, into the cockpit of their cars. And this is his history, and this I think is very authentic in terms of collaboration.
And Aston Martin's current drivers, Fernando Alonso, Lance Stroll, I mean, what's it going to be like working with them?
Well, it's a pleasure. Obviously, I know them both a little bit, and they're charming and talented drivers. Alonso, of course, world champion, and we have to see now what the new season will be. We start from scratch. It's a white piece of paper. Nobody knows exactly what's going on. Everything, all the rules change, as you know. You have hybrid engines, the cars are less wide, less long, etc. And we'll see what will happen in the next coming weeks.
Yeah, and viewership of the season seems to be growing year on year. More and more people are watching Formula One. So what sort of branding opportunities is it going to give you over the next 12 months?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it's because of the Netflix series Drive to Survive. Even my daughter, who is 28 years old, who is obviously a woman, now suddenly is interested in Formula One. I think these series helped a lot to widen the appeal of Formula One. And it's, let's not forget, it's the only sport where every 2 or 3 weeks you have a gigantic Grand Prix with millions and millions of viewerships. So you have continuous coverage, and we will be on the car, we will be on the overalls. Obviously, everybody will wear our watches. And we will activate not only during the Formula One Grand Prix, but as I said earlier, through the two other pillars, and also talk about the history of the brand in relation to the history of our brand. So we have a great field of communication here.
All right, well, I'm based in Australia, obviously. What's the Asia-Pacific luxury watch market like for Breitling? Is it a big market for you?
Well, I mean, the demography is what it is. There are bigger countries with more people living than in Australia. I mean, China is 1.6 billion. I don't think you have a population of 1.6 billion, but it's a great country. It's a great country. We call Australia an outdoor market, meaning the products are more sportier, are more, I would say, bigger. So the market is a little different from what I would say the Italian market, which is a little bit more elegant. We have, by the way, partnerships in Australia with surfing. As you know, we have 3 areas: air, land, and sea. And we are quite active with some world championships also in surfing in Australia, also with Australian surfers. So we're quite active. We have also a little joint venture with Australian brand called Deus Ex Machina. So we love your lifestyle. I love the Swiss lifestyle, but I love the Australian lifestyle. And if we could have a sea, which we don't have, I think that would be the perfect combination, Switzerland and Australia.
Well, in Australia, interest rates are back rising again here. I mean, does that worry you at all with consumer demand, or are your customers pretty well insulated from interest rate increases?
Well, I only have worries. I have worry with the war in Iran. I have worries with the war in Ukraine. I have worries with the exchange rates of the Swiss francs, which is extremely high, which makes our exports more expensive. But this is life. We're not paid to be only sunshine CEOs or managers, and we have to deal with everything. We need to gain market share. We have to be better than competition. But you're right. I mean, the external factors at this moment in time are really painful, and I hope that the world will become a better place very soon.
Okay, and how big a challenge for it was you last year when the United States announced all tariffs on Switzerland in particular? Was that a big issue for you at Breitling? Did you need to simplify the business or make any big changes?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, we first had 39% tariffs versus the US, which was crazy. And then 15, like the European community. We had to increase the prices a little bit in the US and in the rest of the world. Yeah, I hope there are still negotiations going on between Switzerland and the US in order to decrease the tariffs. The US is our biggest market. It's 23% of our turnover. So therefore it has an impact. Again, it is what it is. All these are difficult external factors, and we have to deal with it.
And when you look at the watch market as a whole, I mean, how tough is the competition when there are thousands of watches for sale on the secondary market as well?
Well, it's a little different market. You know, when you go, what we call that the certified pre-owned market. And I'm happy that this market has been structured. So you have real guarantees, and we participate in that market, by the way, with Breitling, with big retailers. So we certify the products, and the customer gets a guarantee.
George Kern, Chief Executive Breitling, great to talk to you today.
Thank you very much.
That's all for the show this Sunday. Up next is all the latest news right here on Sky News. Business Weekend returns next Sunday, but don't forget, you can keep up to date with all the latest business news with our daily program, Business Now, at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thanks for your company. I'm Edward Boyd. We'll see you next week.